All right, thank you for joining us tonight for the role of cotton mills in the Southern economy. This program will help set context for our larger project, which is to document the Borden Manufacturing Company and how Goldsboro was able to support cotton mills. My name is Marty Cheddar, and I have the privilege of serving as the local history librarian. In the fall, our library explores Wayne County agriculture in partnership with the Department of Extension. We call this Harvesting Our History. And the Borden Manufacturing was an important agribusiness. They used raw product for cotton, and it was a large important employer for nearly 100 years. So on our banner, just to point out, here's the Borden mill here in the 1920s. And then before the Borden family was involved with the cotton yarn side, the production side, they actually, Frank Cornigi Borden in 1983 opened up a cottonseed oil company, which made fertilizer and cattle feed. And so that's depicted here as well. And this building's still standing right now on South John Street. So, and it was called the Goldsboro Oil Company, and then later became the Southern Cotton Oil Company, but that was started by the Bordens. All right, so tonight's program is part of the Duncan Public History Series and was made possible by Community Connections LSTA grant by the State Library of North Carolina. Our presenter, Dr. Gary Mock, is a professor emeritus from North Carolina State University, the College of Textiles. He was born, we grew up in New Jersey, but he came south to go to college at Virginia Tech with a degree in chemical engineering, and then he earned a master's degree and a PhD from the same field at Clemson University. He's published and reviewed over 100 academic articles, and in the back on display I have a book that he wrote that he authored on the 100th anniversary of the College of Textiles at NC State that he actually just gave to our collection. So thank you for that. So please welcome Dr. Mock.
They've got me wired up here with two different mics. Can you hear me? I don't know whether I need to be mic'd. Do I need to be mic'd?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. That's on. I'm so fat I can't even get around here. See whether this thing's turned on here. Marty, can you turn this on?
I can hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me just fine.
Your mic.
Yes. Yeah, it's on. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for coming out tonight to be part of this. I hope you find it educational, but more importantly, I think you'll find it enjoyable. And I hope to have that be the main thing for this evening. I'll take you a quick trip through history to see how we got to where we were a few years ago and to see how things changed in North Carolina. Well, it certainly didn't start here. As you probably know if you studied history, the Industrial Revolution was very important, and textiles led the way. After James Watt invented the use of steam power in 1776 in England, then along, and at the same time, or almost the same time, Hargreaves invented something called a spinning jenny that helped them to spin yarn, but that would have been water-powered. Cartwright invented a weaving machine that was automated in 1785, and believe it or not, the first factory under one roof was in England in 1771. But here in the United States, the Brits wanted us to be colonies, and they didn't really want us to have any industrial development at all, so it took a while. We had our little revolution where we chased the British out, and we still had an apprenticeship going even that early. And a fellow by the name of Slater was given a chance to go over to England on kind of a summer holiday and see what he could find out. I think he became our first industrial spy. So Slater went over to England and memorized everything he saw. Came back to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and they built this mill right along the river there, the Blackstone River, and he started building textile equipment that he had seen in England, copying it as best he could and changing it. Some other important people in New England were the Lowell family, and they went north almost toward New Hampshire, and founded the town of Lowell, Massachusetts, which is a famous textile name. Down here in the south, probably the most important thing that happened first was that a Yankee professor from Yale came down to tutor some students, and things weren't going too well, so they said, well, we've got a problem we'd like you to look at. We're having trouble getting that cotton off the cotton seed. So Eli Whitney took advantage of that and developed the first cotton gin. Well, it was such a simple device, and he didn't get it patented very well. And just a few years later, a fellow named Holmes came along and improved Eli Whitney's gin. But we all know that Eli Whitney invented the gin. Well, not too far away in South Carolina, a fellow by the name of Greggs tried to start up a mill, but it just didn't go for him. So that was a big failure. Here in North Carolina, we give credit to a family in Lincolnton for actually building this mill. I don't know whether I can get my pointer there. Water-powered mill. This just looks like an old grist mill that you might have seen with a water wheel on the side, and that would have powered Schenk's mill. So these early mills were water-powered. And today we can't appreciate how important it was to be on a river that had water falling down that gave you the power to turn sawmills, grist mills, and textile mills. The first one here in the eastern part that I can find out was up at Rocky Mount on the Roanoke River. You know about the rapids that come through Roanoke Rapids there, and that's where the first mill was built, 1816. In my part of the woods, Raleigh, at Falls of Neuse, they built a paper mill first, and then that was later converted to textiles in 1896. So if you go up into Raleigh, if you get a chance to go up near the falls coming down from the lake that is the drinking water for Raleigh, that's where you'll find that. Yes, Ruth?
What did the cotton mills do? I mean, what did the mills do? What were they doing?
They were spinning yarn and then weaving it. Very simple. Sorry. In the middle of the state, or sort of in the middle of the state, around Burlington, is the Haw River. Maybe you've been through the Haw River, and it's a very rocky river as you cross the interstate at Burlington and Haw River. But the first mill there was built at High Falls, which is now the town of Haw River. A fellow by the name of Holt was a genius. He built his first factory on the Big Alamance Creek, which feeds into the Haw River. Well, he was very prolific, as many of our grandparents were. I don't know how many children he fathered, but he fathered at least 6 sons that followed him into the textile business. The thing that really put Tarboro on them, not Tarboro, excuse me. If it's Tuesday, I must be in Tarboro, but it's Thursday night and I'm here in Goldsboro. The railroad came through here connecting Weldon, which is located right about here near Rocky Mount, to Wilmington. And so the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad was chartered in 1835, completed in 1840, and where the wagon trail from New Bern headed toward Raleigh, where it crossed the railroad, there was apparently a hotel, if I've got my history right, Marty, correct me, but they moved the county seat and everything to this intersection so that they could be near the railroad and the wagon road that was being used. If you've looked at the rivers in North Carolina, you realize that because they flow mainly from the northwest to the southeast, it's very difficult, or it was very difficult, to go from east to west. Kept running into these rivers that you had to cross. So there were no real large navigable rivers, and it made trade very, very difficult. The people that had these mills, the early mills in this part of the state, floated things down to Wilmington as the major port to get rid of things when they were trading with the English early on. The North Carolina Railroad was built. Construction began in 1851 by a fellow named Moorhead, who you may know the name Moorhead with the Moorhead Planetarium in Chapel Hill. But Moorhead started this construction of the railroad, and that came to Goldsboro in 1855. There's the marker down at the crossroads by the magnolia tree. It was then, 1858, completed to what is present-day Moorhead City. And we know that that's a major port for us now because the railroad can carry all those wood chips down there and load onto the ships. The North Carolina Railroad then was extended, and the destination was to go to Charlotte. And this is a very poor map that I couldn't get a very good picture of. But Charlotte, as you probably know here, and the railroad arced across the Piedmont this way. It crossed the Haw River at this Granite Falls, which is now known as Haw River. And it was such an important thing to have the railroad come by that the mill owner, Mr. Trollinger, said, "I'll build you the bridge across the river if you'll just build the railroad right beside my textile mill." So that's why the old cone mill there in Haw River is right beside the North Carolina Railroad that runs through there. They set up a repair shop at Company Shops, and that's now the town of Burlington. That's all closed and has moved down to Spencer. So if you've been to the North Carolina Transportation Museum, that's what was moved from Company Shops or Burlington. So the early railroads then came from the north, from Richmond down, and they still come down towards Selma, cross over toward Raleigh and on to Charlotte, and we have the connection through Goldsboro down to Moorhead City. The first factory dyed yarn was about 1857 when the Holts were running their mills out in the Burlington area, and a Frenchman came by and said, "I can teach you how to dye indigo and to make indigo blue yarn." And with that, they started developing plaids, and this isn't exactly a plaid that I would call a plaid, but Alamance plaids were developed in that time frame then and became the rage throughout North Carolina and further on. But marketing outside of North Carolina was a very big problem because transportation was still so poor. What was needed to improve things were a few things that we were lagging behind here in North Carolina. We talked about the invention of steam by Watt back at the very first slide over in England years and years ago, and it wasn't until 1876 when the Corliss people showed a really well-producing or very well-run steam engine at the 100th anniversary exhibition that celebrated our 100 years of independence. Now, what we have here on this picture, and Marty, thank you very much for this diagram here. If steam came in from a boiler, it came into this exchange box here and could drive a rod here that would turn this big wheel. And if you could turn this big wheel, you could run a belt to drive machinery in your factory. This, I guess, was taken in the basement of the Borden plant. Marty, is that correct? Here we see the big wheel that had been disconnected. This is all disconnected and no longer connected, but it was installed at the Borden mill or the mill that preceded the Borden mill. I'm not so sure. But with the advent of the railroad coming into the whole area, you could now bring coal from the West Virginia coal fields, the Western Virginia coal fields, and you could transfer cotton around very easily using the railroad. Water power was no longer necessary for you to have a textile mill or a cotton mill. 1880, just north of Burlington, the last water-powered mill was installed in 1880. At Glencoe today, and this is the little restored village of Glencoe on the right-hand side after a snowstorm, here we see the water turbine. By the 1880s, they had built cast iron turbines that they could put into the raceway, bringing water from the Haw River down. It didn't have to fall very far as long as it could turn this wheel. And they could turn the wheel, and this is now sitting outside the derelict mill that's sitting there in Glencoe. And here's the actual turbine itself that would be turning inside the housing. Very interesting. No one's installed a modern version of that, however, there. The next important thing that came along, there was a tinkerer by the name of Edison that was playing around with electricity up there in New Jersey, and a fellow by the name of Tesla that came along. Now this is before this fella now that's getting the Tesla automobile going. But a fellow by the name of Tesla developed an electric motor that was using Edison's electricity. They knew that they could move things with these motors as long as they could generate electricity. And so in 1880, hydroelectric power came along, and it just absolutely exploded. You can see in 8 years, in 8 years, there were over 200 hydroelectric power plants in the eastern United States, just going in one after another. Well, by the 1880s then, all the pieces were really in place to develop a textile industry in North Carolina. Railroads spanned the Carolinas from Charlotte all the way to the Atlantic coast at Moorhead, down to Wilmington if you wanted to go that way, spanning all across the Piedmont, down to Goldsboro and so on. Steam power could be used to run things in the mill. It could also be used to run a dye house, heat water. Electric motors were getting smaller and smaller, and they could be used to drive individual spinning frames or a weaving machine. Large mills started being built, and they attracted labor off the farm, and mill villages were being built. A tremendous time of expansion and contraction. In the 1880s, things were really going very well. In the early 90s, they had a depression, and then things picked up again. So we were trying to justify the expansion of textiles and finding money to invest in that, and then just about the time someone would invest in something, they'd get their cold feet and pull back a little bit, but then eventually things would get going again. Probably the man that we give most credit to for advancing the whole idea was a fellow by the name of Daniel Augustus Tompkins. Now, Tompkins grew up on a cotton plantation in South Carolina, was very technically inclined, and in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, there were really no places where you could get a technical education. He could have gone to the University of South Carolina in Columbia, but that wouldn't have taught him very much of his mechanic skills. There was nothing in North Carolina at that time, and he wound up going up to Troy, New York, near Albany, New York, to Rensselaer, where he became an engineer. And then he interned with the Bethlehem Steel Company to learn to be a practical engineer, spent some time in Germany, and by the early 1880s, he decided business conditions were ripe that he would move himself to Charlotte. So he established a design office in Charlotte and began attracting probably what we would have called master mechanics to come there and learn what he knew about engineering, as we call it today. His mantra was, convert raw cotton to finished goods. This is the only way that we're going to be the New South. And so he was called the champion of the New South. And he said, we've got these cotton seeds that you're just throwing away. There's value in that. There's oil that can be extracted. you can make lots of things out of the products that come out of cotton seeds. And so we had here in Goldsboro, cottonseed mill, oil mill, and textile mill. So he said, we want to build cottonseed oil mills, we want to convert cotton to finished goods, and I'll give you some numbers in just a little bit. But he said, cotton is so cheap, we're sending it down the river, across the ocean to Manchester, England. They're making cloth and sending it back to us. We're selling our cotton for 10 cents a pound, and they're getting $2 a pound for that cloth coming back across the ocean. We need to keep that here in the South. And so that's why they called him the champion of the New South. In order to do this, he said, we need better education for our young men. Of course, only men were supposed to be educated. And he wanted to build the first textile school in his native state of South Carolina. Thomas Clemson gave his plantation over to the legislature to form Clemson University, or Clemson College. People here in Raleigh, the Watauga Club, a bunch of young men downtown Raleigh, said, no, we need a textile program here in Raleigh, and we've got a university. Excuse me, I'm getting way ahead of myself here. We've got to build a school here. They built what is now North Carolina State University, but it was called North Carolina Agriculture and Mechanic Arts. It was the way it started out, to teach agriculture and to teach mechanic arts using the land grant of the Morrill Act that dated back to about 1862. So with Tompkins as a lightning rod, we got a textile program at North Carolina State University. Tompkins said, I've been designing textile mills since 1882. I'll tell you what, I'll design a textile school for you, and we'll build it there along Hillsborough Street. So this is the first textile building built in 1901. It looks very much like a traditional cotton mill. It looks very much like Mr. Borden's mill up here just north of downtown. Hillsborough Street, if you know anything about Raleigh, running from downtown out to the new fairgrounds, that's Hillsborough Street right there. And there's an animal standing here in the front yard. Now, I can't for the life of me figure out, why do they call that a cow college up there? But sure enough, this was the first building that was built. One end of the building, seriously, was the textile mill. It was a cotton mill built to train everybody with the practical arts of how to run a cotton mill. The other side of the building were the classrooms, where you could learn all of the practical studies. So, that's North Carolina A&M's first textile building, designed by Daniel Tompkins. Looks very much like the Borden mill right up here. We tried to determine whether there was any connection between Tompkins and the designer of this mill, and I'd say there's a little bit of difference if you start looking at the architectural features. Probably not the same architect or the same designer, but the same general idea. A brick building, 2 stories, maybe 3 stories occasionally, a tower in the front. I'll go back to the other picture here. They built quite a tall tower on the front of this that was at first a staircase and is a staircase, but you would wonder, why in the world would you put windows up here? Where's my pointer? 3rd floor, 4th floor, 5th floor, and a tower on the top. Well, the original provision was that you could put a water tower or a water tank in that tower to help you with a fire. Well, naturally, there wasn't enough money to put a water tower inside that tower. So what do you think happened to this building in 1914? It burned to the ground. They had to rebuild it. I didn't bring you any pictures of that, but the idea was, if they had just had water there, they might have been able to put out the fire that destroyed the building. So, I'd like to read a little quote that Tompkins would go anywhere to talk to anybody about the wisdom of building a textile mill. Here's a quote that he read. He said, "I attended a funeral once in Pickens County, Georgia. He was a poor fellow. They buried him in the midst of a marble quarry, but the tombstone was from Vermont. They buried him in the middle of a pine forest, but the coffin was imported from Cincinnati. They buried him within the touch of an iron mine, and yet the nails that hold that coffin together and the iron and the shovel came down from Pittsburgh. The South didn't furnish a thing but the corpse and the hole in the ground." And he must have been a very persuasive speaker, because he told that story over and over and over again, that we needed to build the New South. And these were some of the figures that he used to illustrate his point. Of course, during the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, however you want to call it, cotton prices were all over the map because of the high demand and hard to ship it. By 1870, supposedly, we were harvesting nearly 3 million bales of cotton, and it was selling for 24 cents a pound, exporting a lot of it either to New England or across the ocean to Manchester, England, which was their textile center. 10 years later, production had risen to 5.5 million bales, but the price had dropped to 12 cents a pound. And you can read the numbers. Farm income declined, and you had to produce 3 times the amount of raw cotton to make the same amount of money. Now, guys, you got to use your head, and you got to use it here in town. And so he worked with the local people to invest money in their local textile mills. So, the 1890s, when Tompkins was really on a roll, mills were built all across the Piedmont, down onto the flatlands, because you could build with a steam, you had electricity. Every small town that had intelligent businessmen financed a small mill with local money. Everybody wanted to be part of this new emerging technology. So here was the emerging technology of the 1890s. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the northern bankers formed marketing companies. They knew where the money was. They would advance money to small mills that were struggling, with the idea that we'll buy your finished goods or your raw material from you when you're finished spinning the yarn or when you're finished weaving, and will help you through the hard times. But of course, anybody that runs a bank knows that they loan money at high interest rates. So they advanced the idea of selling yard goods to stores all across America, so that they put people in touch with the Macy's, the John Wanamakers of Philadelphia, Sears and Roebuck, and so on, to bring goods out of the South and market them throughout the United States. Textile machinery was not built in the South. This was far too advanced for us at that time. You had to go to New England, preferably to Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and up against the Maine corridor. Right in that area was a hotbed of textile machinery building. Paterson, New Jersey, just across from Manhattan, New York, and Philadelphia. Philadelphia was probably the leading industrial city at that particular time. If you wanted to buy textile machinery, you would get on the train and go north to buy machinery from the White & Company, Sacco Lowell, and many other textile machinery companies that were in these northern towns. This particular frame, I think, was this in the Borden mill? This particular, Marty, I don't know.
I did find some old letters that the Bordens did buy machinery from Whiten.
Whiten.
And Harvard does have those records, so
Well, I put my magnifying glass on this particular plate here, and it said that this particular spinning frame came from Leeds, England. So they were importing textile machinery from England, installing it in our mills. Other things were needed, and then they were also coming from the north. Here are 3 boilers that are sitting side by side, and I guess again in the basement of one of the mills here in Goldsboro. This, if you read the banner across the top, is from the Erie Cast Iron Works in Erie, Pennsylvania. So they were going all the way over to the Great Lakes by Buffalo, New York, Erie, Pennsylvania, and bringing cast iron boilers down here to the south. Some of the people that got involved in textile manufacturing, and I'll try to hit some of the highlights of some of the bigger companies. Moses and Caesar Cohn were immigrants coming over from Germany. They settled in Baltimore, and eventually their marketing skills pulled them down to the south where they could find goods that they could buy from the mills and market to the north. They traded and bartered. Not a lot of cash was involved, but they would take goods and trade you. They worked with John Belk of Charlotte, who eventually started the Belk department stores. He worked with the Holts, the people that I talked about in the Burlington area that were making those Alamance plaids. And he probably worked with the Wheels here in Goldsboro at the department stores. So how do you think the Wheels would have gotten goods to sell in the store? They would have gotten it by rail from these various mills all over the state to bring in the yard goods that were sold. Cone boys decided that it wasn't sufficient for them to pick up things, odds and ends from the Holts and the Bordens and other people that were producing in the smaller towns. So they decided to build their first denim mill in Greensboro, and they built the famous White Oak plant. And eventually the Cone people became the largest producers of denim in the whole world. You may have heard of the fellow by the name of Cannon. James Cannon, again, was a merchant. Went up to Concord, just above Charlotte, and built the first mill there. Started making what we would call today wiping cloths, but then had the idea that terry toweling would be something that people would want. And so founded the town of Kannapolis, which is a play on Cannon, the town of Cannon, if you will, became the largest towel manufacturer in the world. Charles Cannon, then, the son of James, really grew that business to a huge business. There's nothing left in Kannapolis today. There's a biotechnology center on the site of that largest towel factory. You may have heard of Fieldcrest Mills. A fellow by the name of Marshall Fields had a big department store in Chicago. He was looking to source goods for his stores in the Chicago area. So he united several mills around what is called Eden today, but it wasn't called Eden then, but it's called Eden now, and built mills to have, I think, the very first store brand, the Fieldcrest brand. And a fellow by the name of James Spencer Love was going bankrupt in Gastonia, trying to run textile businesses west of Charlotte. And they were having trouble in Burlington, and it's almost like NFL football coaches. You get fired in one place, and you go 3 miles down the road, and you're the new hope for this new collection. Well, he wound up in Burlington, and just at the time that a new fiber called rayon was coming into the marketplace. And Love had the special talent and put rayon to use. Eventually, bedspreads and very comfortable soft clothing out of rayon. He eventually established the largest collection of mills in the United States that we then knew of as Burlington Industries. People asked me as they came in tonight, well, how are the textile business doing? You know, we went through a terrible time in the 1990s. Many, many, many mills folded across the United States. But I really think there's a great rebirth. I spent 29 years at the College of Textiles. We saw tremendous changes. And the things that we taught when I first came to NC State, we're not teaching today because we had to adjust to the marketplace. Today, the fastest growing business across North Carolina are something called nonwovens, where we don't have to spin yarn. We can convert fiber into a web that might be the trunk liner on your car, or it might be a soft padding in the ceiling of your car, but a lot of automotive textiles come in the United States today. A lot of industrial marketing and medical textiles are very big. So there's quite a future for textiles. That's the end of my formal talk this evening. I'm not running up against 8 o'clock here, but I'd be glad to answer any questions. I'd like to thank Marty very much for calling me on the phone and inviting me to come down and spend the evening with you. I'd like to thank the Borden family for getting textiles up and running here in Goldsboro, and the Wayne County Public Library for putting on a program like this tonight. Thank you very much.